The first sign of trouble wasn't subtle. It was bright yellow, zip-tied to Jake Turner's fence, and screamed in bold letters, "Property under review, HOA compliance required." Jake Turner, a retired Navy SEAL turned ranch owner, stared at the sign like it was some kind of bad joke. His ranch wasn't part of any HOA, never had been, never would be. He ripped it down with one swift motion, muttering under his breath, "What kind of circus act is this?" Tossing the sign into his barn, he figured that was the end of it. But oh no, this was just the opening act. The next morning, as Jake walked out to feed his goats, there it was again, this time nailed to his barn door. The audacity! If there's one thing you don't mess with on a man's property, it's his barn. Jake's patience was wearing thinner than a dollar store tarp in a rainstorm. He yanked the sign down again, but this time he kept it as evidence. Something about this whole situation didn't sit right. Later that morning, Jake vented over coffee with his neighbor Tom, a retired firefighter who'd seen his fair share of nonsense. "Tom," Jake said, holding up the sign like it was a piece of incriminating evidence in a courtroom drama, "have you ever dealt with an HOA that thinks they're running Quantico? I mean, what's next? A SWAT team for my goats?" Tom chuckled and leaned back in his chair. "Jake, sounds like you've got yourself a Karen situation. You know, clipboard in one hand, superiority complex in the other." And sure enough, that afternoon, Karen Whitmore herself made her grand entrance. She rolled up in her golf cart like she was leading a parade, except she was the only one in it. Clipboard? Check. Stack of papers? Check. An attitude sharp enough to cut steel? Double check. Karen didn't waste any time. She marched right up to Jake with all the self-importance of someone who'd just been promoted to head hall monitor. "Mr. Turner," she began in a tone that suggested she thought she was addressing a wayward teenager instead of a grown man who'd survived combat zones. "These goats are in violation of HOA regulations. And that fence over there? It's not up to code." Jake raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms. "Lady," he said slowly, "I'm not even in your HOA. This ranch has been here longer than your subdivision." Karen sniffed and flipped through her papers like she was looking for some ancient scroll that would prove her right. "Well," she said finally, "we're expanding our jurisdiction." Jake couldn't help himself. He laughed out loud. "Expanding your jurisdiction? What are you, the Roman Empire?" Karen didn't find it funny. She jabbed her finger at Jake's chest and declared ominously, "You'll be hearing from us." And hear from them he did. The next morning, as Jake sipped his coffee on the porch and watched the sunrise over his property, he spotted two men skulking along his fence line. They were dressed in khakis and vests labeled HOA Patrol, as if that made them official, and were armed with clipboards and radios like they were on some covert operation. Jake watched them for a moment from his porch before deciding he'd had enough. He walked out calmly but with purpose, the kind of walk that made insurgents think twice back in his SEAL days. "Got a badge?" he asked when he reached them. The two men froze like deer caught in headlights. One of them stammered, No." "Then you're trespassing," Jake said matter-of-factly. He pointed toward the edge of his property line. "And I don't take kindly to trespassers." In their scramble to leave, one of the men dropped his clipboard. Jake picked it up and noticed something strange. A map with his property marked as Alpha, High Resistance. High Resistance. Jake smirked. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Realizing this wasn't just some harmless HOA busywork but something more coordinated, and frankly ridiculous, Jake decided to call in reinforcements. Colt Harris, a local sheriff's deputy and an old buddy from high school. Colt showed up within an hour and listened as Jake explained what had been happening while showing him the clipboard map. Colt shook his head and whistled low under his breath. "Jake," he said finally, "you've got yourself a real piece of work here. Karen's been pulling stunts like this for years, pushing boundaries where she doesn't belong." "Well," Jake replied with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, "she picked the wrong ranch this time." With Colt's reassurance that he'd keep an eye on things, Jake got to work fortifying his property. Not with barbed wire or sandbags, though he briefly considered it, but with motion sensors and cameras strategically placed around every corner of his land. That evening, as he reviewed footage from earlier in the day, Karen's so-called HOA patrol pacing nervously along his fence line. He couldn't help but laugh. Turns out, he muttered to himself while pouring another cup of coffee, retirement isn't as boring as I thought. The next morning, Jake was up early, sipping his coffee and watching the sun rise over his ranch. It was shaping up to be another peaceful day, or so he thought. Just as he was about to head out to check on his goats, he spotted movement near the far edge of his property. Two figures in khakis and vests labeled HOA Patrol were back, pacing along his fence line like they were surveying enemy territory. Jake set down his coffee mug and sighed. "Here we go again," he muttered to himself. He grabbed his boots, threw on a jacket, and made his way toward the trespassers with the kind of calm determination that only a Navy SEAL could muster. As he approached, the two men froze mid-step. One of them was holding a clipboard while the other fiddled with a radio that looked like it had been bought at a yard sale. Jake stopped a few feet away and crossed his arms. "Morning," he said evenly. "You boys lost." The man with the clipboard cleared his throat nervously. No, sir. We're conducting an HOA compliance inspection." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Compliance inspection? You do realize this ranch isn't part of your HOA, right?" The man hesitated, glancing at his partner for backup. The other guy shrugged, clearly out of his depth. Jake took a step closer, his voice dropping to a level that could freeze water. "Let me ask you something. Got a badge? A warrant? Anything that gives you the right to be on my property?" The clipboard guy stammered. No." "Then you're trespassing," Jake said bluntly. He pointed toward the edge of his property line. "And I don't take kindly to trespassers." The two men exchanged panicked looks before turning tail and scurrying off like scared rabbits. Jake watched them go, shaking his head in disbelief. But as he turned to head back to the house, something caught his eye. A clipboard lying in the dirt where one of the men had dropped it in their rush to escape. Jake picked it up and flipped through the pages. What he found was both ridiculous and infuriating. Maps of his property marked with notes like Alpha, High Resistance, and Potential Non-Compliance Hotspot. There were even hand-drawn diagrams of his barn and fencing with annotations about unauthorized livestock. Jake couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Back at the house, Jake called Colt Harris, his old high school buddy who now worked as a sheriff's deputy. Colt arrived within an hour, pulling up in his patrol truck with a look that said he was ready for some entertainment. Jake handed him the clipboard and explained what had been happening over the past few days. The signs, Karen's visit, and now these wannabe HOA enforcers. Colt flipped through the pages, whistling low under his breath. "Jake," he said finally, "you've got yourself a real piece of work here. Karen's been pulling stunts like this for years, pushing boundaries where she doesn't belong." "Well," Jake replied with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, "she picked the wrong ranch this time." Colt nodded thoughtfully. "I'll look into this and see what I can dig up on her HOA antics. In the meantime, you might want to beef up your security." Jake didn't need to be told twice. That afternoon, he got to work installing motion sensors and cameras around every corner of his property. He even set up a few decoys, fake cameras mounted on posts, to keep Karen's crew guessing. By evening, Jake was reviewing footage from earlier in the day when something caught his attention. Karen herself had been snooping near his fence line in her pink golf cart, clipboard in hand and phone pressed to her ear. She seemed to be giving orders, probably to her so-called HOA patrol. Jake couldn't hear what she was saying, but her exaggerated hand gestures made it clear she was plotting something. "Turns out," Jake muttered while pouring himself another cup of coffee, "retirement isn't as boring as I thought." The next morning brought more surprises or annoyances depending on how you looked at it. As Jake walked out to check on his goats, he noticed yet another sign zip-tied to one of his fence posts. "Final warning, compliance required immediately." This one had been laminated for extra durability, because apparently Karen thought weatherproofing her nonsense would make it more legitimate. Jake tore it down with a growl and marched straight back to the house to call Colt again. When Colt arrived later that afternoon, he wasn't alone. Deputy Sheila Taggart had come along for backup. Sheila was no stranger to dealing with HOA drama. She'd once had to mediate a dispute over lawn ornaments that nearly ended in fistfights. As Jake showed them the latest sign and shared footage from Karen's golf cart reconnaissance mission, Sheila couldn't help but laugh. "This lady really thinks she's running Homeland Security," she said, shaking her head. Colt nodded in agreement. "Sheila's right. Karen's got delusions of grandeur." "Well," Jake replied dryly, "she can keep her delusions off my property." Colt promised to keep digging into Karen's activities while Sheila offered some advice. "Document everything, signs, trespassers, anything suspicious. The more evidence you have, the easier it'll be to shut this down." Jake took their advice seriously and spent the next few days documenting every interaction with Karen's crew, from their awkward attempts at surveillance to their increasingly ridiculous signs. By now, Jake had amassed enough evidence to fill a binder, and he wasn't done yet. One afternoon, while reviewing footage from his cameras, Jake spotted something new. Karen's HOA patrol had returned, but this time they'd brought reinforcements. 5 men in khakis were pacing along his fence line with clipboards and radios while Karen supervised from her golf cart like some kind of wannabe general. Jake couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. But deep down, he knew things were about to escalate further. For now, though, he'd enjoy watching Karen's circus unfold, because if there was one thing Jake knew for sure, it was that these HOA clowns had no idea who they were messing with. Started at 4:30 in the morning. Jake Turner was jolted awake by the sound of his motion sensor alarms blaring from the monitor in his living room. He groggily stumbled out of bed, grabbed his glasses, and stared at the screen. What he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. There were 5 figures creeping along his property line, dressed in khakis and vests that looked suspiciously similar to the ones worn by Karen's so-called HOA patrol. They had headlamps strapped to their foreheads, clipboards tucked under their arms, and radios clipped to their belts. One of them was even carrying what looked like a measuring tape, as if they were about to conduct a full-scale land survey in the middle of the night. Jake blinked at the screen, trying to process what he was seeing. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered to himself. He grabbed his boots, threw on a jacket, and headed for the door. But this time, he wasn't going alone. Jake had already called Colt Harris earlier that week to warn him about Karen's antics escalating. So when Jake picked up the phone and dialed Colt's number, it only took 2 rings before Colt answered. "Let me guess," Colt said, his voice groggy but amused. "Karen's at it again?" "She sent her goons," Jake replied. 5 of them this time. They're sneaking around my property like they're on some kind of secret mission." Colt sighed. "All right, I'm on my way. I'll bring Sheila too. She loves this kind of nonsense." By the time Colt and Deputy Sheila Taggart arrived, Jake had already positioned himself on his porch with a thermos of coffee and his binoculars. The 5 HOA patrol members were still skulking around near his fence line, whispering into their radios like they were coordinating a raid. Sheila stepped out of the patrol truck and took one look at the scene before bursting into laughter. Are they wearing headlamps? At 4 in the morning?" Jake nodded. "And clipboards. Don't forget the clipboards." Colt shook his head in disbelief. "All right, let's go have a chat with these clowns." The 3 of them made their way toward the trespassers, who didn't notice them until they were practically standing right behind them. When Jake cleared his throat loudly, one of the men jumped so high he nearly dropped his clipboard. "Morning," Jake said casually, though there was an edge to his voice that made it clear he wasn't messing around. "Care to explain what you're doing on my property at this hour?" The man who appeared to be the leader straightened up and tried to look official. "We're conducting an HOA compliance inspection," he said, though his voice wavered slightly under Jake's intense gaze. Jake raised an eyebrow. "At 4:30 in the morning? With headlamps? You know how ridiculous you sound, right?" The man opened his mouth to respond, but Sheila cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Let me stop you right there," she said, pulling out her badge and holding it up for all 5 men to see. "I'm Deputy Taggart with the County Sheriff's Department, and what you're doing is called trespassing." The leader paled visibly. We have permission from Ms. Whitmore," he stammered. Sheila smirked. "Ms. Whitmore doesn't own this property, and she doesn't have the authority to send you here." She gestured toward Colt, who was already writing down their names and taking photos of their clipboards for evidence. Jake crossed his arms and stared down at the group with a look that could melt steel. "You've got two options," he said calmly but firmly. "Option 1. You pack up your little operation and get off my property before I call every news station in the state to report on Karen's HOA SWAT team. Option 2. You stay right where you are while Deputy Taggart here arrests you for trespassing." The 5 men exchanged panicked glances before scrambling to gather their equipment and make a hasty retreat toward their cars parked down the road. As they disappeared into the distance, Sheila turned to Jake with a grin. "Well, that was entertaining." Jake chuckled dryly. "Glad you enjoyed it." But just as they were about to head back toward the house, another sound caught their attention. The faint whine of a golf cart engine growing louder by the second. "Oh no!" Colt muttered under his breath. Sure enough, Karen Whitmore came barreling down the road in her pink golf cart, complete with a homemade siren attached to the roof that wailed like an injured cat. She screeched to a halt just outside Jake's property line and jumped out, clipboard in hand and fury written all over her face. "What is going on here?" she demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at Jake like he was some kind of criminal mastermind. Jake leaned casually against one of his fence posts and gave her a lazy smile. "Morning, Karen. Your little patrol team seems to have gotten lost. They were trespassing on my property." Karen's face turned redder than a ripe tomato as she turned her glare toward Colt and Sheila. "They were conducting an inspection. This property is in violation of HOA regulations." Sheila raised an eyebrow and held up her badge again for emphasis. "Ms. Whitmore, this property isn't part of your HOA jurisdiction. And even if it was, sending people onto private land without permission is illegal." Karen sputtered incoherently for a moment before finally managing to say, "I'll be filing a formal complaint about this harassment." Jake couldn't help but laugh at that one. A deep belly laugh that echoed across the ranch like thunder after a storm. "Harassment?" he repeated incredulously. "Karen, you sent 5 guys onto my property at 4 in the morning with clipboards and headlamps. If anyone's being harassed here, it's me and my goats." Karen opened her mouth to argue but seemed to think better of it when she noticed Colt jotting down notes on a notepad. "You haven't heard the last of this," she snapped before storming back to her golf cart and driving off in a huff. As they watched her disappear into the distance, Sheila turned back to Jake with a grin. "You weren't kidding when you said she was persistent." Jake shook his head with a wry smile. "Persistent doesn't even begin to cover it." He glanced down at one of the abandoned clipboards still lying on the ground nearby and picked it up with a sigh. "Well," he said as he flipped through its pages filled with nonsensical notes about fencing regulations and livestock zoning laws, "at least now I've got more evidence for my binder." The next day, Jake decided it was time to dig a little deeper into Karen's antics. If she was willing to send her khaki-clad patrol team onto his property at 4 in the morning, who knew what else she was up to? And Jake wasn't the kind of man to sit back and let someone like Karen push him around. He'd dealt with tougher adversaries in his SEAL days. Karen Whitmore was just another mission. After a quick call to Colt, Jake learned that Karen's HOA had been the source of complaints for years. According to Colt, she'd been involved in everything from fining people for having the wrong shade of mulch in their flower beds to threatening legal action over holiday decorations that didn't meet her aesthetic standards. But what really caught Jake's attention was this. Karen had been using HOA funds for some questionable activities. "She's got a history of overreach," Colt had said. "But this whole thing with your ranch? It's next level crazy, even for her." Jake couldn't agree more. So he decided to take matters into his own hands, or rather, into the hands of some very helpful internet sleuths. He uploaded the footage from his security cameras, the headlamp-wearing patrol team, Karen's golf cart antics, and even the laminated signs, to a popular online forum dedicated to exposing HOA horror stories. He titled it, "When Your HOA Thinks They're the FBI." The response was immediate. Comments poured in from people all over the country who dealt with similar HOA nightmares. One guy shared how his HOA had fined him $500 for having unauthorized grass clippings on his driveway. Another woman said her HOA president installed cameras to monitor how long people left their trash cans at the curb. It was like a support group for people terrorized by power-hungry HOAs. But then came the real gold. Someone in the comments recognized Karen. "Wait a minute," one user wrote. "Is this Karen Whitmore from Desert Ridge Estates? I used to live there. She tried to fine me $1,000 because my mailbox wasn't regulation beige. She's notorious for pulling stunts like this." Another commenter chimed in. "She once hired a drone company to fly over our neighborhood and take pictures of people's backyards. Said it was for compliance purposes. Pretty sure that's illegal." Jake couldn't believe what he was reading. Drones? Unauthorized surveillance? This was no longer just about laminated signs and trespassing. It was starting to sound like Karen had been running her own little dictatorship. Armed with this new information, Jake called Colt again and filled him in on what he'd learned. Colt promised to look into it further and suggested they pay a visit to one of Karen's former neighbors who had moved out specifically because of her antics. The next morning, Jake and Colt drove out to meet Dave Miller, a retired teacher who'd lived under Karen's reign of terror for 3 years before finally selling his house and moving to a quieter neighborhood. Dave welcomed them into his home with a knowing smile. "Let me guess," he said as they sat down at his kitchen table. "Karen's causing trouble again?" "You could say that," Jake replied dryly. Dave shook his head and sighed. "That woman is something else. When I lived in Desert Ridge Estates, she fined me every other week for things like having my garage door open too long or parking my car slightly off-center in my driveway. But the worst was when she started using drones." Jake leaned forward. "Tell me more about these drones." Dave nodded grimly. "She hired some company to fly drones over the neighborhood and take pictures of people's backyards. Claimed it was to ensure compliance with landscaping regulations. But I'm pretty sure she just wanted an excuse to spy on everyone." Colt frowned. "Did anyone report her?" "Oh, plenty of us did," Dave said. "But she always found some loophole or excuse to weasel out of trouble. And most people didn't want to deal with the hassle of fighting her. They just paid their fines and kept their heads down." Jake felt a surge of anger on behalf of everyone who'd been bullied by Karen over the years. But he also felt something else. Determination. If Karen thought she could pull this kind of nonsense on him, she had another thing coming. Back at the ranch, Jake started compiling all the evidence he'd gathered so far. The footage from his cameras, screenshots of comments from former neighbors, and even copies of the ridiculous signs Karen had posted on his property. He organized everything into a neat binder labeled Karen Whitmore Case File. It felt almost therapeutic. Meanwhile, Colt and Sheila were busy digging into Karen's financial records, specifically how she'd been using HOA funds. What they found was interesting, to say the least. She's been using HOA money for personal expenses, Colt told Jake during one of their evening check-ins. Trips to fancy resorts, expensive dinners, even spa treatments, all listed as administrative costs. Jake couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. So not only is she running an illegal surveillance operation, but she's also embezzling funds? This just keeps getting better. But then Colt dropped another bombshell. Karen had also been filing false complaints against residents who challenged her authority. Claims about noise violations, unkempt yards, and other petty issues that were completely fabricated. She's weaponized bureaucracy, Colt said with a shake of his head. And she's gotten away with it because most people don't have the time or energy to fight back. Well, Jake replied with a grin, she picked the wrong person this time. With all this new evidence in hand, Jake decided it was time to take things up a notch. He reached out to a local news station that specialized in investigative reporting and shared everything he'd uncovered about Karen's antics, from her fake patrol team and drone surveillance to her misuse of HOA funds. The reporter he spoke with was immediately intrigued. "This sounds like something straight out of a bad TV drama," she said during their phone call. "We'll start looking into it right away." As word began to spread about Karen's behavior, more former residents came forward with their own horror stories, and some were even willing to go on record for the news segment. By the end of the week, Karen Whitmore wasn't just an HOA president. She was officially the most infamous HOA president in town. And Jake? Well, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he watched everything unfold. Because if there was one thing he knew for sure, it was this: you don't mess with a Navy SEAL or his goats and expect to get away with it. Jake Turner was starting to think he'd seen it all when it came to Karen Whitmore's antics. Fake patrol teams, headlamps at dawn, laminated signs. It was like living in some sort of HOA-themed sitcom. But just when he thought things couldn't get any more ridiculous, Karen decided to escalate her campaign of absurdity to an entirely new level. It started with the arrival of a manila folder, hand-delivered by one of Karen's lackeys. Jake was out fixing his fence when the guy pulled up in a beat-up sedan, looking about as confident as a kid delivering bad news to their parents. He handed Jake the folder without saying a word and practically sprinted back to his car. Jake stood there for a moment, staring at the folder. It had Regional Initiative Phase 2, stamped across the front in bold letters, like it was some kind of top-secret government document. Intrigued and mildly annoyed, he opened it up and began flipping through the pages. What he found was bizarre. Inside were copies of official-looking documents with government seals, maps of his ranch marked with red lines and arrows, and a letter that claimed his property was part of a strategic compliance initiative aimed at modernizing rural land use. The letter warned that noncompliance could result in fines, property seizures, or even legal action. Jake couldn't help but laugh. Modernizing rural land use? He muttered to himself. What does that even mean? Are they going to replace my goats with Wi-Fi routers? Still, something about the documents didn't sit right with him. They looked official, too official for Karen's usual brand of nonsense. So he called Colt Harris again and asked him to come take a look. When Colt arrived later that afternoon, he brought Deputy Sheila Taggart along for backup. The two of them spent nearly an hour poring over the contents of the folder, while Jake leaned against his truck, sipping coffee and watching their reactions. Finally, Colt looked up and said, "Jake, this is weird. Tell me about it," Jake replied. "Is it legit?" Colt shook his head. "Not exactly. These documents have real government seals on them, but the wording is all wrong. Like someone copied parts of real legal forms and slapped them together into a Frankenstein version." Sheila nodded in agreement. "It's like she's trying to scare you into thinking this is bigger than just her HOA nonsense." Jake smirked. "Well, she's gonna have to try harder than that." But as they continued digging into the folder's contents, they stumbled across something that made them pause. Emails between Karen and what appeared to be a federal agency discussing land acquisition strategies. The emails were vague but hinted at some kind of coordinated effort to push rural landowners off their properties using bureaucratic pressure tactics. Colt frowned as he read through the emails again. This might actually be connected to something bigger. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Bigger how?" "Well," Colt said slowly, "it's possible Karen's HOA shenanigans are part of a larger plan to buy up rural land for development projects, or something along those lines." Jake let out a low whistle. "So she's not just harassing me for fun. She's harassing me for profit." "Looks that way," Sheila said grimly. Jake felt his blood boil at the thought. It was bad enough dealing with Karen's fake patrol teams and drone surveillance, but now she was trying to mess with his livelihood, his home, his goats. "All right," Jake said firmly. "Time to take this up a notch." He spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence he could find. The emails from Karen's folder, screenshots from her HOA website showing questionable financial transactions, testimonies from former neighbors who'd been bullied into selling their homes. All of it went into his ever-growing binder labeled Karen Whitmore case file. Meanwhile, Colt reached out to some contacts in state government to see if they could shed any light on Karen's supposed connections to federal agencies. What he learned only confirmed their suspicions. Karen had been using her position as HOA president to cozy up to developers and investors who were interested in acquiring rural properties for commercial projects. "She's basically acting like a middleman," Colt explained during one of their evening check-ins. "She pressures people into selling their land cheap, then turns around and sells it to developers for a profit." Jake shook his head in disbelief. "And she thought she could pull that stunt on me? She probably didn't realize who she was dealing with," Sheila chimed in with a grin. "Well," Jake replied dryly, "she knows now." Armed with this new information and an ironclad case file, Jake decided it was time to confront Karen directly. He waited until the next HOA meeting, which he wasn't technically allowed to attend but decided to crash anyway, and walked in carrying his binder like it was a trophy. The room went silent as Jake strode up to the front table where Karen sat surrounded by her loyal followers. She looked up at him with an expression that could only be described as equal parts shock and fury. "Mr. Turner," she began in her usual condescending tone. "This is a private meeting. Save it," Jake interrupted, slamming his binder down on the table with enough force to make everyone jump. "We need to talk." Karen tried to regain her composure but failed miserably under Jake's intense glare. "I don't know what you think you're doing here," she sputtered, "but you're not part of this HOA, and yet you've been harassing me nonstop for weeks," Jake shot back. He opened the binder and began flipping through its pages, pointing out each piece of evidence as he went. The fake patrol teams, the drone surveillance, the embezzled funds, the emails about land acquisition, it was all there. By the time he finished his presentation, which felt more like cross-examination, Karen looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. The other HOA members stared at her in stunned silence before one finally spoke up. "Karen? Is this true?" Karen tried to stammer out an excuse but was quickly drowned out by angry voices demanding answers and accountability. As chaos erupted around him, Jake leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile. Because if there was one thing he knew for sure, it was this: you don't mess with a Navy SEAL or his ranch and expect to get away with it. The fallout from Jake's dramatic HOA meeting crash was swift and, honestly, hilarious. Karen Whitmore, the self-proclaimed queen of compliance, was now the talk of the town, and not in a good way. Word spread fast about her shady dealings, her fake patrol teams, and her ridiculous attempts to intimidate Jake Turner, the retired Navy SEAL who wasn't about to let her get away with it. But Karen wasn't one to back down easily. No, she decided to double down on her nonsense. It all began 2 days after the meeting when Colt Harris called Jake with some news. "Jake," Colt said, barely able to contain his laughter, "you're not going to believe this. Karen just filed a formal complaint against you." Jake raised an eyebrow as he leaned back in his chair. "A complaint? For what?" "Apparently," Colt said, reading off the document, "you've been intentionally obstructing HOA operations and creating a hostile environment for compliance officers." Jake let out a bark of laughter. "Hostile environment? I offered those guys coffee after I caught them trespassing." "Well," Colt replied with a chuckle, "Karen seems to think you're the villain in this story." Jake shook his head in disbelief. "All right, let her play her games. I've got bigger fish to fry." And bigger fish he did fry, because while Karen was busy filing complaints and trying to salvage her reputation, Jake and Colt were working behind the scenes to bring her entire operation crashing down. The first step was a visit to Karen's house. Armed with a warrant obtained thanks to the evidence Jake had provided, Colt and Deputy Sheila Taggart arrived at Karen's front door one sunny afternoon. Jake wasn't technically allowed to join them for the search, but he couldn't resist parking his truck across the street and watching the show unfold. Karen answered the door looking as smug as ever, until she saw the warrant in Colt's hand. Her face went pale as she tried to argue, but Sheila cut her off with a sharp, "Ma'am, step aside." Jake watched from his truck as Colt and Sheila disappeared inside Karen's house. For the next hour, he could see them moving from room to room, occasionally carrying out boxes of files and electronic equipment. At one point, Sheila emerged holding what looked like a binder labeled "Compliance Scripts." When they finally finished, Karen stood on her porch looking like she'd just been hit by a freight train. Colt handed her a receipt for the seized items and said something Jake couldn't hear, but whatever it was made Karen's jaw drop. Later that evening, Colt filled Jake in on what they'd found. "Jake," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "you wouldn't believe what we pulled out of that house." She had binders full of scripts for dealing with non-compliant residents, surveillance logs on half the neighborhood, including you, and even financial records showing how she'd been funneling HOA funds into her personal bank account. Jake whistled low under his breath. So she really was running her own little empire. "Oh, it gets better," Colt said with a grin. "We also found emails between her and some developer where she outright admits to using intimidation tactics to force people into selling their properties. Jake couldn't help but laugh. She practically handed you a confession on a silver platter. She did, Colt agreed. And now we've got everything we need to take her down. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and public outrage as Karen's misdeeds were exposed for all to see. The local news station ran a series of investigative reports detailing everything from her misuse of HOA funds to her illegal surveillance activities. Former neighbors came forward with their own horror stories about living under Karen's rule. Stories that ranged from infuriating to downright absurd. One man claimed Karen had fined him $200 for having an American flag that was too large. Another woman said Karen had threatened legal action because her front door wasn't painted an approved shade of beige. And then there was the guy who'd been forced to tear down his kid's treehouse because it didn't meet HOA height regulations. As more and more people spoke out against Karen, it became clear that she'd been running her HOA like a personal fiefdom for years, and now it was all coming back to bite her. Meanwhile, Jake was enjoying every minute of it. He'd become something of a local hero for standing up to Karen and exposing her corruption. People stopped him at the grocery store to shake his hand and thank him for taking on the HOA tyrant. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Jake received an invitation to attend the special HOA meeting where Karen would officially be removed from her position as president. The meeting was held in the community center gymnasium, which was packed with residents eager to see justice served. Jake arrived early and took a seat near the back, content to watch the chaos unfold from a distance. Karen sat at the front of the room looking defiant, or at least trying to look defiant, but it was clear she knew what was coming. The HOA board members wasted no time laying out their case against her. Financial misconduct, abuse of power, illegal surveillance. The list went on and on. By the time they finished reading through the charges, Karen looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. When it came time for residents to speak their minds, one man stood up holding a stack of fines he'd received over the years. Fines that added up to nearly $5,000. This, he said loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear, is what happens when you give someone like Karen Whitmore too much power. The crowd erupted into applause as others began sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation at Karen's hands. Finally, after what felt like hours of testimony against her, it was time for the board members to vote on whether or not Karen should be removed from her position. It wasn't even close, unanimous decision. Karen Whitmore was officially out as HOA president. As she slunk out of the gymnasium under a chorus of boos and jeers from angry residents, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Because if there's one thing he knew for sure after all this drama, it's that you don't mess with a Navy SEAL or his goats and expect to win. The fallout from Karen Whitmore's downfall was nothing short of spectacular. After the HOA board officially ousted her, the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. People who had lived under her reign of terror for years were finally free to paint their doors whatever color they wanted, fly flags of any size, and, heaven forbid, park their cars slightly off-center without fear of a fine. It was like the HOA had gone through a liberation movement, and Jake Turner? Well, he was the unofficial hero of the whole ordeal. Jake didn't care much for the spotlight, but he couldn't deny that watching Karen's empire crumble had been deeply satisfying. It wasn't just about getting rid of her laminated signs or fake patrol teams. It was about standing up to someone who thought she could bully her way through life unchecked. And if there's one thing Jake knew from his Navy SEAL days, it's that bullies don't fare well when they meet someone willing to push back. But Karen wasn't done yet. Oh no. Even after being stripped of her title as HOA president, she couldn't resist one last attempt at revenge. A week after the meeting, Jake received a letter in the mail, a handwritten note from Karen herself. It was equal parts pathetic and hilarious. The letter began with Karen accusing Jake of ruining her reputation and turning the neighborhood against her. She claimed she'd been misunderstood and unfairly targeted by people who didn't appreciate her vision for compliance. But then came the kicker. Karen threatened to sue Jake for defamation. Jake read the letter twice just to make sure he wasn't imagining things. Then he laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Defamation? He said aloud to no one in particular. "Lady, you did this to yourself." He showed the letter to Colt later that day, who practically doubled over with laughter when he read it. "Jake," Colt said, wiping tears from his eyes. "If she actually tries to file a lawsuit, it'll be the shortest court case in history." "Let her try," Jake replied with a shrug. "I've got enough evidence in my binder to bury her 6 times over." Sure enough, Karen never followed through on her threat. Whether it was because she realized she didn't have a leg to stand on or because she finally accepted defeat, Jake didn't know. And frankly, he didn't care. He was just glad she'd finally decided to leave him alone. With Karen out of the picture, life on Jake's ranch returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after weeks of chaos. His goats were happy, his fences were secure, and his motion sensors were finally quiet again. He even started getting visitors, neighbors stopping by to thank him for standing up to Karen and sharing their own stories about living under her rule. One neighbor brought over a pie as a token of gratitude and told Jake about how Karen had once tried to fine him for having an unauthorized garden gnome on his front lawn. Another neighbor admitted she'd been too scared to speak out against Karen until Jake exposed her corruption. "Jake," she said earnestly, "you've inspired all of us. You showed us that we don't have to put up with people like her." Jake smiled and waved off the praise. "I didn't do anything special," he said modestly. "I just didn't let her push me around." But deep down, he felt proud. Not just for himself but for everyone who'd found their voice because of what happened. Meanwhile, Karen's reputation continued to nosedive. The news reports about her shady dealings had gone viral, and people from all over the country were sharing their own HOA horror stories online. Many of them inspired by Jake's original post on the forum. One particularly popular comment read, "Karen Whitmore is proof that some people shouldn't be allowed within 100 feet of a clipboard." Another user joked, "If your HOA president starts wearing headlamps at 4 a.m., it's time to move." Jake couldn't help but laugh every time he checked the forum and saw new posts about Karen's antics. It was like watching a bad sitcom play out in real time and knowing you'd helped write the script. But perhaps the best part came when Jake received an invitation from another neighborhood. Not Desert Ridge Estates, but a nearby community that had heard about his battle with Karen and wanted him to speak at their next HOA meeting. Jake initially declined. Public speaking wasn't really his thing, but after some convincing from Colt and Sheila, he agreed to go. When he arrived at the meeting hall, he was greeted with applause and cheers from residents who'd been following his story online. "Mr. Turner," one man said as he shook Jake's hand, "you're an inspiration." Jake chuckled awkwardly and replied, "I'm just a guy trying to protect his goats." During the meeting, Jake shared his experience dealing with Karen, from the fake patrol teams to the laminated signs, and offered advice on how to handle power-hungry HOA presidents. "Document everything," he told them. "Take pictures, keep records, and don't be afraid to stand your ground. Bullies thrive on fear. Don't give them that power." By the end of the night, Jake felt like he'd made a difference. Not just for himself but for everyone who'd ever felt helpless against an overreaching HOA. As he drove home that evening, Jake couldn't help but reflect on how far things had come since that first yellow sign appeared on his fence weeks ago. What started as an annoying nuisance had turned into something much bigger. A reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for others too. And if there's one thing Jake learned from this whole ordeal, it's that you don't mess with a Navy SEAL or his goats and expect to win. So if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare or know someone who has, hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and don't forget to comment below with your own HOA horror stories. Let's keep this conversation going, and maybe even inspire someone else to stand up for themselves too. And hey, if you enjoyed this tale of revenge and ridiculousness, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this one. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, never underestimate a man with goats.